Welcome to Borders Talk, dots, dashes, and the stories they tell. We are Zalfa Fagali
and Gillian Roberts, two border studies academics in England's East Midlands, from different countries with multiple passports. Welcome to this episode, which is focusing on border art. Our guest today is David Stirrup, professor in the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York, which he joined in 2023 after nearly 2 decades at the University of Kent. He's published 2 monographs, Louise Erdrich from 2010 and Visuality and Visual Sovereignty in Contemporary Anishinaabe Literature from 2020. He's co-edited Tribal Fantasies, Native Americans in the European Imaginary 1900 to 2010 with James Mackay, Parallel Encounters Culture at the Canada-US Border with the very shady co-editor, also known as Gillian Roberts, published 2014. Enduring Critical Poses Beyond Nation and History with Gordon Henry Jr. and Margaret Newton from 2021. And The Canada-US Border Culture and Theory with Jeffrey Orr, which came out just a few months ago. From 2012 to 2015, David was principal investigator on the Leverhulme Trust-funded network Culture and the Canada-US Border, with yours truly as co-investigator, and a number of collaborators from the UK, US, and Canada. Since 2017, he's been PI on the AHRC-funded Beyond the Spectacle Native North American Presence in Britain, with Jacqueline Fear-Segal from UEA and Cole Thresh from UBC. In 2022 to 23, he was UK PI on the AHRC NEH grant Indigenous Knowledges, a digital exchange and best practice pilot with Jennifer Jenkins from the University of Arizona, Rhiannon Sorrell from Diné College, and partners at the Wellcome Collection. As of 2023, he is co-investigator or co-PI with Chris Anderson from the University of Alberta on the AHRC-funded project, The Métis, a Global Indigenous People.
David launched Europe's first Centre for Indigenous and Settler Colonial Studies at Kent, drawing on a broad network of institutions in the UK, US, and Canada. The hub of the centre has come to York with him, with co-directors at Kent, Alberta, and the London College of Communication. Alongside research activity, the centre collaborates with non-university groups, including the Indigenous rights-focused NGO Incomindios UK, the Greenham Conham Shoshone Nuclear Colonialism Project, and the Scottish Métis Cultural Alliance. David is a very busy man, and we are thrilled to welcome him to the podcast. Because this is an academic podcast, we've leaned in really hard on listing David's many professional achievements, but it's worth saying that they don't tell the whole story, and we want to say out loud, and for our hardcore and non-hardcore listeners, of course, that other than being very clever and very accomplished and very modest, David is a fundamentally generous person who, I will take your name in vain, Gillian, in our experience, wears his kindness lightly. He is also a very cool dude with a legendary beard.
Indeed. Fun fact about David, he has been known to live on a boat. So David, welcome.
Thank you.
How did you get interested in border studies?
That's a great question. I'm not sure is the first answer, but I may have been working on Indigenous North American literary contexts, at least for 25 years, I suppose, right from the end of my undergraduate degree onwards. And I think one of the most striking things for me in doing that work was always the lack of cross-border conversation. The vast majority of people in the field that I was associating with were working on either Native American literatures or they were working on Indigenous literatures from Canada. And there was very little comparative work. There was very little communication even, like between writers, between critics. So I think in that sense, my introduction to border studies was just a desire to cross that border and to think more about how relationships kind of transcend it, ignore it, and so on. And that just led me very reluctantly into border studies territories.
And I say reluctantly.
I say reluctantly just because And I think it's changed massively. And I think, I mean, you two have contributed to that change in very significant ways. But I was deeply resistant to the ways border theory itself has tended to be sort of picked up and dropped in locations other than this. I've always been the same. I don't know whether whether it's a kind of suppressed conservatism or what, but like I always the same about magical realism, the way it kind of gets stripped out of its Latin American context and thrown around the world as if the politics of that context don't matter. And I'm kind of like, no, keep everything local. So my reluctance was I wasn't finding any conversation about indigeneity and the Canada-US border that helped to theorize the stuff I was looking at. But I was really reluctant to just start looking to the southern border. And actually, I think that was probably an aspect of my conservatism, because I think some great work has been done in recent years doing just that, but still with attention to the kind of political specificity of that southern border theory as well. So yeah, that was my way in, and I'm still here to a degree. I still have on my laptop all of the ideas for a book I was going to write when we were working on culture on the Canada-US border. And one day I might actually write it, although I suspect most of my ideas are pretty obsolete now. So yeah, the Métis work is the work of the last few years. That exhausting list has taken me away a little bit from border studies, but it's still very much there in my thinking.
I'm very curious to hear about this list of ideas, which I'm sure are phenomenal. Do you want to say any more at this point about where you were provisionally headed?
It's kind of interesting, actually, in the sense that the sort of central premise that I was interested in exploring is something that we're looking at very closely in the Métis project. But it wasn't me who suggested it for the Métis project. It was my co-I, Chris. I wanted to think about, this isn't revelatory in any sense whatsoever, but I wanted to think about indigeneity in the Canada-US borderlands through a kind of Cliffordian lens of roots and routes.
Well,
and I just think there's so much literature that offers itself to that kind of conceptual framework, because I'm really interested in the way indigeneity itself gets figured at different moments in history as either kind of entirely static and place-bound or highly mobile and nomadic.
Yeah.
And of course, the in current terms of settler colonialism, the static place-bound model is the one that is foregrounded. But as we all know, the border was not something that was part of Indigenous life and experience until fairly recently. And so thinking about how writers who do engage with that border figure both movement across it and the way it prevents movement is kind of what interests me.
I definitely think there's something in there for when you have loads of free time.
Well, I think there is. What I really need to do, though, is persuade a few more Indigenous writers to write about the border, because that's the other thing that I know you both know as well, that there's some brilliant work, but there's not as much as you might think. Like, particularly when you compare it to the volume of writing about the US-Mexico border, which for very obvious reasons has attracted huge amounts of critical and creative attention. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack sometimes, looking for specifically Indigenous writing about Canada-US border.
That is about it, rather than us reading the border into it, you know.
Into it, yeah.
There's genuinely about the site, because that's the thing I'm interested in, is the concrete site. There's lots of great work about conceptual psychological borders, all of that. But I am interested in representations of the actual space itself, the site of the border and the borderlands. And they're hard to come by. I really want to write about Eric Gansworth's work. So Eric is an Onondaga writer who lives on Tuscarora Reservation in Upper New York State. And he's written a few things about the border that are really interesting, but he's not, for whatever reason, he's not that widely written on at this point. And his work's really interesting. So I've got him in mind. And there are others. Louise Erdrich has done a bit of border crossing.
Yeah.
and others who we probably should get into because of the politics of pretendianism at this moment in history.
Wow, indeed.
But yeah,
Right.
it's sitting there waiting. At some point, I'll either get to it or it'll be gotten to by someone else, and then I can move on.
You've written a book about Anishinaabe culture, and you've worked a lot with Anishinaabe collaborators. To what extent is your interest in the border fueled by the fact that the Anishinaabe straddle the Canada-US border, or is that straddling part of your interest in the Anishinaabe? Obviously, you just mentioned the Onondaga as well from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but can you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I think it's probably been a big driver. Again, because there's a disconnect, right? So the Anishinaabe traditional territory is huge, absolutely gargantuan, and it spans the border and from the eastern edge of the Great Lakes all the way across to the plains. It's an absolutely massive territory within which bands and families and so on, would have been kind of regularly circulating. It's very much split in two by the imposition of the border. But unlike nations or the confederacies like the Haudenosaunee, that it didn't kind of bifurcate a community in quite the same way. So there's lots of communities along the border who still move within cross-border territories, but there isn't a kind of single community that's kind of very visibly, markedly cut in two like the Mohawk at Akwesasne were. And I think as a result of that, the border doesn't kind of feature as distinctively in Anishinaabe literary or cultural studies as you might expect it to.
Yeah.
And a lot of I have friends from north and south of the border who they very much talk of one another as family, but they also see themselves as quite distinct from one another. And there are very clear linguistic distinctions between Ojibwe dialects in Canada and the US, for instance. So that is all, I think, really interesting, both for the way the border just disrupts the kind of flows of trade and stuff in the Great Lakes. The Michigan Peninsula is one point where traditional kind of trade and hunting territories get sliced into. But at the same time, there are so many continuities that kind of erase the border among the Anishinaabe that those aspects definitely drew me in.
So those distinctions between North and South, to what extent is that just due to geographical distance? And to what extent is it down to that border precisely?
So I think it's both. The geographical distance has meant that there are northern communities who are perhaps more autonomous, or certainly more, I'm trying to think of the right word here, and have been able to stay more remote from the state, shall we say, than more southerly communities. So that makes a difference. But also, I think the differential impacts of Canadian and US settler colonialism has made a big difference. So yeah, I mean, my friends from Canada are definitely Canadian, and friends from the US are definitely American. Like the cultural distinctions we might make between the two nation states are definitely there in their kind of cultural outlook. I think the imposition of the border is very much part of that difference.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. In terms of border art, we've been talking a lot about literature, but what about border art has specifically caught your interest?
This is a little preamble. I have no training in art history whatsoever.
That's okay. Neither do we.
I am married to an artist, to a painter. He has educated me over the years in a way that I don't think any university course could have done. So I started writing about art. I mean, I write about art in the way a literature person would write about art. So if there are any art historians listening to this, don't worry about reading it. It's just going to annoy you. But I started writing about art with that background. And I think I came to border art with the same kind of desire to think about the space and the site, as I mentioned before, in relation to the literature. So the relationship between art and its location, particularly in sites where that location itself is provocative. I like political art, which annoys the heck out of my wife because I'm certainly political about this. And shut up. But I think that border art just drew me in immediately because it is inherently political, regardless of the subject matter, because of its location. And like I suspect most people who are interested in border art, it was really the stuff at the US-Mexico border.
Yeah.
It got me intrigued, and then I started looking for examples on the Canada-US border to see what was happening up there. And it just so happened that some of the most interesting examples were by Indigenous artists. So that's where that interest started.
Maybe for listeners who don't really have a sense of what border art looks like, either at the US-Mexico border or at other border sites, including the Canada-US border, is there something that you feel is or that you found is emblematic, or are there differentiations that you identify in the literature sort of there as well?
I think there are differences, not least because the two borders themselves are so unbelievably different, or at least have been in recent history. Canada-US border, long known as the longest undefended border in the world. The US-Mexico border, as I'm sure everybody is intimately familiar since the Donald Trump era began, a site of major conflict and contestation in the last several decades at least. The art of the US-Mexico border has often tended to focus on that site as a site of friction, of tension, of conflict, of trauma. Whereas the Canada-US border has tended to, I don't know, it's kind of a lighter touch. So it's one of the interesting things about the Canada-US border is that the border art significantly increased after 9/11 and the increase of security on that border. So it's, to that point, you start to see more work that focuses on things like surveillance and the difficulty of crossing rather than. Prior to that, I think a lot of the work at Canada-US border was more kind of environmentalist in its concerns, interested in that space as a set of kind of geographical features, geopolitical aspects to it. But it's really since 9/11 that the politics has come to the fore, I think. Whereas in the US-Mexico border, the politics has long been there. So the first piece of artwork that got me interested in the US-Mexico border was Alberto Caro's border coffins from 1994. So this is a series of painted coffins that were attached to the border fence, and each of them represented a year, and he painted on each coffin the number of people who died trying to cross the border that year. So it was not a subtle piece of art, but hugely impactful. Yeah, so I think for me that's one of the emblematic pieces of border art.
1994 as well. I mean, that's the year NAFTA comes into effect, which may well have been
probably
part of
not an accident.
The prompt.
Definitely. And I mean, border art in the US-Mexico border, I think, goes back at least to the early 70s and ties in with the labor movement, with protest more broadly in Latin American countries against the impact of the state.
Zalfa has been nodding vigorously, so I'm going to put you on the spot and ask if there's any kind of iconic for you examples of Mexico-US border art.
I really enjoyed work by Ursula Beeman, probably from around the same period, lots of video art around the Maquiladoras. And I mean, in particular, and it's stuff that I'm interested in at the moment, border art that is responding to or engaging with feminicide and around the US-Mexico border. But yeah, I think Ursula Beeman is the person who got me into thinking about US-Mexico border art. And there's lots of stuff in relation to that. But I do remember sometime after 9/11, there was a series of billboards that sort of appeared in South Texas, I think. And it was in sort of gibberish writing. And they got reported, didn't they? Because lots of people thought it was Arabic and like the terrorists were talking to each other.
Yeah.
You can always rely on me to come up with like an Arabic story in the border. But so, yeah, and I think
it's your USP.
Well, yes, indeed. my OSP, my only. And so I think just sort of the border as this side of it, I think that's emblematic of the border is different understandings of vulnerability. You know, who is vulnerable at and because of the border, and how is it actually designed to and destined to create those affective experiences of vulnerability and fear. Whereas my limited granted experience of thinking about border art at the Canada-US border is that it has the luxury in a way of being a little bit more conceptual. It doesn't have to be in your face all the time because it doesn't have that very storied, it is nonetheless violent, but it doesn't have that very kind of storied history of violence and militarization, as it plays out in militarization. Did that gel with what you've seen, David?
It does, yeah. And I think, so ostensibly both, they're a central kind of thematic at both borders is the question of movement. But historically, at one border site, that movement has been contested and certainly psychically violent when it comes to Indigenous people crossing the Canada-US border. Yeah. But it hasn't been a kind of military site in the way that the US-Mexico border has. Kind of going back to actually one of Gillian's earlier questions, there have been two aspects that I've not actually properly thought about yet, but that definitely interest me. And the first of them is that one of the things that has long attracted a lot of scholarly attention at the Canada-US border is Akwesasne, is the way the Mohawk are split in, the Mohawk community is split in two by that border, the way the Mohawk have used that border as a site of political contest, have continued to trade and then being caught up in all sorts of accusations of smuggling, and that there's lots of tobacco crossing that border that Mohawk traders argued was conducted under the terms of their own treaty and the Jay Treaty, which supposedly, theoretically at least, allows Native people free passage within the terrain that treaty was written in. So that attracts a lot of attention as a border site, as a site of protest and contest and so on. But the same hasn't been true of the Tohono O'odham on the southern border, on the US-Mexico border, which again is entirely split in two by that border. And in some respects, I think is actually more. I mean, I don't use the word like. I feel I'm being all anthropological today, saying this is interesting, isn't it? Look at what the impact on this community has been. It's not what I mean, but in the US, the Tohono O'odham are recognized. They have a reservation, sits right on that border. In Mexico, nothing. They are still there, and they're very much still connected to the community north of the border. But they weren't given land in the same way. They weren't given state protection in the same way. But that site has just not been seen as interesting in quite the same way as the Akwesasne border crossing, even though that, it has increasingly gained attention as being an obvious gateway through the US-Mexico border. Yeah. So that was one thing. And then I think the other thing, kind of coming back to Zalfa's comment about the US-Mexico border and relating to Maquiladora factories and things, is the fact that, again, there's a kind of coterminous story on the northern border around people trafficking, particularly of Indigenous women and girls in the Great Lakes area. Yeah. That doesn't have half the attention paid to it as what's happened at the US-Mexico. But I think it's just, I can't, at this point in time, have nothing more interesting to say than that it is interesting, frustrating, enraging, that there are these kinds of differences in terms of attention paid, and the ways in which the liberal discourse around the Canada-US border can sometimes obscure some of these incredibly traumatic and violent stories.
I feel like that is Canadian settler colonialism all over, isn't it?
It is to an extent, yeah. But then I think I'm still puzzled as to why the Tohono O'odham story doesn't get the kind of attention that, I'm talking in scholarly terms here. I think there's plenty of news stories about what happens at that border site,
and certainly folks there care. It's
absolutely, yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's about a different group, isn't it?
Yeah. There's a fantastic historian, I think he's at the University of Arizona, called David Martinez. He's Tohono O'odham, and I'm pretty sure he's just become the director of a border studies centre or something at U of A. And he's one of the few people who does scholarly thinking about Tohono O'odham as a community member. So I think there will be kind of more attention. Another person who does a little bit of that work is a woman called Fantasia Lynn Painter, who's also, I think she's a community member, but she's at UC Riverside. So I think that, there are shifts, there are changes, but if you look back at the kind of scholarship historically, it's just a kind of curious gap.
Can you give us some examples? We've been talking about US-Mexico border art. Can you give us some examples, David, of Canada-US border art that has piqued your interest?
Yeah, I can. But before I do, I want to give you another example of US-Mexico, because I think 100% agree with Alpha that the work at the Canada-US border has tended to be more conceptual. But there's a lovely piece from 2015, Repellent Fence it's called, by Post Commodity. And it's still, it's hard sitting in the same way that Border Coffins was, but it is more conceptual. They basically suspended these massive helium balloons at intervals across a long stretch of the US-Mexico border. Big yellow helium balloons with what looks like a kind of target painted on them. They're supposed to be reminiscent of things that they put up to scare birds away.
Yeah.
But obviously it's, aimed at people rather than birds. It's an interesting piece because it's so, they're not targets, but because they look like targets, it kind of invokes a certain understanding of the US-Mexico border as violent, but they couldn't stop you physically because they're spaced apart. There's no fence, but they're there to deter passage through that space, or at least they represent the deterrence of passage through that space. So they're very clear and clearly political, but somewhat more conceptual.
It's an interesting combination of the tangible and the ephemeral, right? In the gaps between the balloons, which are sizable,
they're huge,
right? Like they're huge gaps.
Yeah.
But then this sort of insistent straight line of these balloons with, as you say, the visible target-like markings on them.
And
you can't forget about it.
No, you can't. I mean, they are huge, and I think there's a 2-mile stretch of border that they're also visible for miles and miles and miles. I like that big kind of monumental thing. I'm a fan, although I've discovered I might be the only one these days, but I'm a fan of Christo, Jean Christo, the guy who used to wrap buildings and islands and things in brightly coloured fabrics. I think there's something about the kind of dramatic visual impact of that big monumental site-based work.
Well, that's reminding me of is it Ana Teresa Fernandez and the blue sky?
I was just about to say that.
Literally, kind of art on the monument in that sense, and erasing the fence and what was it called? Blue Sky.
I can't remember the title.
Anyway, she painted the border fence blue to match the sky, and I think it was in Tijuana, right? And it was sort of extending into the point at which the fence extends into the sea. That's extremely arresting, even while it's arresting in that it stops you, even while the image erases the line. That stops you. So it's really, really interesting, and then the artist, I forget their name now, who cannonballed themselves across.
That was Javier Teres.
There you go.
Yeah,
I should have written this stuff down. No,
that was brilliant.
About the
It's brilliant. Yeah,
I really love Richard Liu's The Border Door.
Yeah,
outside Tijuana, and the sense of the potential border crossers, and there's the users of the door, then there's the spectators of the door.
Yeah.
But all of these ways of kind of sort of erasing or trying to find ways through what is a very forbidding even more than the Sharpie, which we keep coming back to. It's a lot bigger than the Sharpie line.
Yes.
Now, definitely, let's segue into the Canada-US border. What sort of examples have resonated for you, David?
So the first piece that I wrote about, and that is still the one that dominates my thinking, is a piece called Third Bank of the River by Alan Michelson, who's a Mohawk artist from up in New York State. And I think, again, so there are various aspects of it that appeal. It is inherently political. It can't be anything other than political. It's sited at one of the post 9/11 border sites at Messina. It's sited inside the main hall, so anyone who has to walk into passport control is confronted by this piece of work. And it's monumental as well. I think it's about 30 feet long.
Yeah.
And 10 feet high, something like that. So it's a big piece of artwork. You can't not see it. You can see it through the glass frontage of the border station as you drive through the border. And it's one of those pieces of work where I've written about it and I still feel like I don't fully appreciate the work it's doing. But so to describe it to anyone who doesn't know it, it's a glass and light installation. It's made up of dozens and dozens of photographs of a stretch of the river along the border between New York, Cornwall Island, which is part of Akwesasne, and then it is Ontario still, not Quebec, at that point.
I think so.
Yeah. So the photos themselves have kind of been sepiaed out into an off-white and purple and then pieced together to echo the two-row wampum, which is a belt, a covenant made of wampum shells. It's like 5 stripes, basically, a white, purple, white, purple, white. And the 2 purple lines in it, this was a covenant that was, or a belt, sorry, made to represent a covenant between Mohawk and or Haudenosaunee and other peoples in that area, and Dutch in particular in 1613. And the 2 purple stripes are intended to represent a European ship and an Indigenous canoe, both travelling separate, independent paths, but sharing the same space. So they're connected by the white strips. And, the principle of that agreement underpins treaty making for Indigenous peoples in that part of Canada and the US from that point onwards, which is that the space can be shared, but neither party has the right to interfere in the self-governance and self-determination of the other. So you can share resources, you can share living space, but you remain independent, you remain separate, and you remain self-governing. So having said it can't be anything but political because of where it's sited, there's obviously a very clear kind of politics in its content as well, in its subject matter.
And it's composed of photos, isn't it? That are taken from the water, which when you're looking at all of these shorelines from the water, I think that's so evocative of this whole idea of artificial borders, which seem even more artificial on water, even though they're artificial on land as well.
Yeah.
And I think one of the interesting things about this piece, Third Bank of the River, is precisely where it is cited, in this very U.S. government building. And it's hard to imagine a kind of equivalent at the Mexico-U.S. border, but other people may have more intel than me. But something that continues to be something that you grapple with, the state citing of this piece.
No, it really is, not least because it was a commission, right? So I think that's the other thing that, actually, that another distinction that we've not made that we might. That border art has often been a kind of form of guerrilla art, right? It's protest, it's subversive, it's done without permission, and so on. And so, for a piece like this that is so inherently political, to have actually been actively commissioned is interesting in all sorts of ways. So on the one hand, I mean, my sense of this piece is probably profoundly more political than Alan himself would describe it as. When you read the official descriptions of it, it's a rumination on the geography of the river there. It's a rumination on the long history of cooperation and collaboration between the various communities that live there, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So there's a celebration as well as much as anything else, and it speaks of welcoming people through that space. All of which, yeah, fine, that's definitely happening. But it's also, it cannot help but remind you that that space is Indigenous space. And being reminded that, so because you at this crossing, at the Messina crossing, you cross first onto Cornwall Island, which is Akwesasne land, and then cross again because the river goes around Cornwall Island on both sides. So briefly, in Cornwall Island, you are an uninvited guest on Akwesasne territory. And the contests at that site, between police and Mohawk people moving freely, and more recently between the Mohawk and the US's desire in particular to place armed border patrols on the island itself, have been really significant. There have been a number of occasions where Haudenosaunee people have blocked that crossing for precisely that reason. So this piece of work does a lot of subtle political work that's not necessarily written about in its kind of official framing.
Yeah.
And I think that does. I don't think Alan would ever accept, just from conversations I've had with him, I don't think he would necessarily accept that this is the case. But it reminds me of a piece of work in the British Museum. I can't remember the artist's name now, but it's a copper, right? So this is Northwest Coast artwork. Coppers were significant and highly prized objects that were held by chiefs. So the copper in the British Museum was made fairly recently, and it's made to look like the bonnet of a car. And on this copper is etched a 4-line sketch that the official narrative of the British Museum, what the artist told the British Museum, represents a traditional story about a bug that eats through the roots of a forest and causes the forest to fall. What the artist told everybody else was that it represents a bug eating through the foundations of the British Museum, causing the British Museum to collapse. And so there's a part of me that's desperate to project this kind of thinking onto third bank of the river. They're like, whatever the official story is about what this is doing, actually what it's really doing is insisting
this border crossing is going down.
Insisting that this is Indigenous space, that when you cross this space, you are reminded that the Two-Ray Treaty, the Caswenta, as it's called in Haudenosaunee, was an agreement that still stands for the Haudenosaunee people, that this is not something that time, modernity, anything else has usurped. It still stands. You are still on Indigenous land. You are there as a guest only, as an uninvited guest. You should respect and honour the sovereignty of the people whose land it is. It does that work for me, whether that is intentional or not. And I think it does that work at the same time as it does we've all managed to live together in this space for all these years, which of course we know isn't entirely true because there's been so much contest there.
Yeah.
But there is no doubt with it having been commissioned by the state that, I don't know, there is a slight tension there.
And the containment resistance tension, I think, is what makes it so good.
Yeah. The other thing I love about that border site is it had on the other side of it, in massive letters, they put United States. So the Canadians knew where they were going. And then they had to take the letters away after 9/11 because they realised it made it a very big target. But I think... I just think, it is always going to be interesting when a state as interested in the projection of power as the US chooses to commission something like this, which, there are all sorts of ways in which there's intent to kind of interpolate Indigenous aesthetics into that state power machine going on in that commission. But I think that just the nature of the piece of work itself resists that.
That's an amazing example, David. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's now time for our final segment, which is Borders I have known. David, tell us about a border that you have known.
I've known many. I mean, I could tell you all sorts of ridiculous stories about conversations with immigration officials at US airports, but I think I'm just going to humiliate myself with a different example from when I was 19. So my undergraduate degree was in English and German. I spent a year living in Vienna and working in a couple of schools there, and I used to regularly take trips to various different European cities with friends. And we all decided to go to Bratislava. We got to the border. At that point in time, this is pre-Schengen. So at that point in time, when you get to borders, the train stops, border officials get on, check everyone's passports. 19-year-old David had entirely forgotten his passport because he'd entirely forgotten that they were traveling through a border. It was a Sunday. The border town, I can't remember its name, but it was a very, very sleepy little place. And I was hoofed off the train. And I got to spend, I think it was 4 hours, lying on a bench in this tiny little train station in the middle of nowhere, waiting for a train back to Vienna. And that turned out to be the closest I ever got to Bratislava. But yeah, I have a fondness for that spot now. It just, in so many ways, it feels like it sums me up.
You think I'll lie down?
Yeah, lying down on a bench in the middle of nowhere because I stupidly forgot something. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
But as I say, I mean, I could regale you with all sorts of great conversations with immigration officials who were very reluctant to believe that anybody in Britain would work on American literature, because nobody in America would work on British literature. This was
That's literally never happened. I agree. Not even one time.
Yeah,
it wouldn't. Why would it? Why would they even want to?
I think we're going to have a future episode that is just
David's
completely
border
based
story.
on, well, I was going to say questions that border guards have asked, because they,
yeah, that would be great.
It's a genre.
It really is.
In and of itself.
So, folks, if you're listening, submit your questions.
Yeah, assumptions they make as well. Like I had to wait in Vancouver airport once for a religious beard to come and pat me down after I failed the chemical swab test. There were 5 border guards around me, and none of them did anything. I was like, what's happening? And 20 minutes later, a Sikh man came and patted me down, at which point I realized they must have assumed that my beard was religious and that I needed someone similarly religious and bearded
to pat you down.
Pat me down, yeah.
We did say that your beard was legendary. It is internationally
recognized in Canada.
Well, thanks very much, David, for all of your stories and for telling us about all kinds of amazing artwork as well.
Thanks, David.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
What borders have you known? Tell us your stories.
Until next time, we've been Zalfa and Jillian on the line. Thanks for listening.